Start Hour 16. Page 479. Healthy Marriage and Relationship Education, HMRE Program. The HMRE program is part of the ACF Office of Family Assistance. The following policies should be implemented. Utilize HMRE funding or grants to provide state-level high school education resources and curriculum on healthy marriages, sexual risk avoidance, and healthy relationships. Early interventions and prevention are much more cost-effective than our efforts to reach people already in broken relationships. Allow child welfare funding to be used for marriage and relationship education. Congress should adopt the following recommendation from a report issued by members of Congress's Joint Economic Committee. Children are far more likely to experience abuse when they are raised outside of their married parent family. Title II of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act provides grants to communities for the purpose of preventing child abuse and neglect, and one of the stated purposes for which the grants can be used is for efforts to increase family stability. However, Congress could change the law to make it clear that Title II funding can be used for healthy marriage and relationship education. Funding provided under Title IV-B of the Social Security Act, which provides grants to states for foster care and adoption services, can also be used for promoting healthy marriage. States should consider using some of their Title IV-B funding for providing healthy marriage and relationship education for families at risk of having their children placed in foster care. Provide educational information on healthy marriage and relationships at Title X family planning clinics. HHS should require clinics it funds under Title X, Family Planning, to provide information to customers about the importance of marriage to family and personal well-being and refer them to available federal, state, and nonprofit marriage resources. Ensure proper assessments with enough time to assess HMRE programs. Although some widely available assessments of HMRE programs report poor outcomes, many of these assessments either utilized a poor methodology or tried to measure program success prematurely. Recent assessments have shown increasing effectiveness and positive community-level marital outcomes. The HMRE program should receive a fair and realistic assessment. Additionally, the positive role of faith-based programs should be protected and prioritized so that these programs do not receive undue scrutiny or pressure to conform to non-religious definitions of marriage and family as put forward by the recently enacted Respect for Marriage Act. Protect faith-based grant recipients from religious liberty violations and maintain a biblically based social science, reinforced definition of marriage and family. Social science reports that assess the objective outcomes for children raised in homes aside from a heterosexual, intact marriage are clear. All other family forms involve higher levels of instability. The average length of same-sex marriages is half that of heterosexual marriages, financial stress or poverty, and poor behavioral, psychological, or educational outcomes. For the sake of child well-being, programs should affirm that children require and deserve both the love and nurturing of a mother and the play and protection of a father. Despite recent congressional bills like the Respect for Marriage Act that redefine marriage to be the union between any two individuals, HMRE program grants should be available to faith-based recipients who affirm that marriage is between not just any two adults, but one man and one unrelated woman. Healthy Marriage and Responsible Fatherhood, HMRF, program. This program is located within the ACF Office of Family Assistance. Its goal, like that of the HMRE program, is to provide marriage and parenting guidance for low-income fathers. This includes fatherhood and marriage training, curriculum, and subsequent research. Implement a pro-fatherhood messaging campaign. With nearly 41% of children born without a married father in the home, and nearly 69% among Black Americans, the fatherhood problem is clear. Similar to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' 2022 fatherhood bill, HMRF funds should be used to support national messaging campaigns that affirm the role fathers play in the lives of their children, that recognize the financial hardships the fathers themselves face, and that seek to provide relationship education to fathers who are raised without a father in the home. Fund effective HMRF state programs. Grant allocations should protect and prioritize faith-based programs that incorporate local churches and mentorship programs or increase social capital through multi-layered community support, including, for example, job training and social events. Programs should affirm and teach fathers based on a biological and sociological understanding of what it means to be a father, not a gender-neutral parent, from social science, psychology, personal testimonies, etc. Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, ACYF, allocate funding to strategy programs promoting father involvement or terminate parental rights quickly. ACYF is currently considering different programs to encourage parents, especially fathers, to engage with their children in foster care. While these program ideas and initiatives are still in the early planning stages, promoting responsible parenthood to reintegrate children or at least keep a consistent male figure in the minor's life is crucial. At the same time, in cases where the father or mother does not make a sincere or serious effort to be involved in the child's upbringing, termination of parental rights for children in foster care should be swift. Office of Head Start, OCHES, eliminate the Head Start program. Head Start, originally established and funded to support low-income families, is fraught with scandal and abuse. With a budget of more than $11 billion, the program should function to protect and educate minors. Sadly, it has done exactly the opposite. In fact, approximately 1 in 4 grant recipients had incidents in which children were abused, left unsupervised, or released to an unauthorized person between October 2015 and May 2020. Research has demonstrated that federal Head Start centers, which provide preschool care to children from low-income families, have little or no long-term academic value for children. Given its unaddressed crisis of rampant abuse and lack of positive outcomes, this program should be eliminated along with the entire OHS. At the very least, the program's COVID-19 vaccine and mask requirements should be rescinded. Administration for Community Living, ACL, support palliative care. Physician-assisted suicide, PAS, is legal in 10 states and the District of Columbia. Legalizing PAS is a grave mistake that endangers the weak and vulnerable, corrupts the practice of medicine and the doctor-patient relationship, compromises the family and intergenerational commitments, and betrays human dignity and equality before the law. Instead of embracing PAS, policymakers should focus on the benefits of palliative care, which works to improve a patient's quality of life by alleviating pain and other distressing symptoms of a serious illness. HHS ACL should survey their programs to ensure that they are supporting vulnerable persons of age or disability and are not facilitating or encouraging participation in PAS. Readdress the national strategy to support family caregivers. While in theory the strategy aims to support family members with duties to care for older family members, the plan is overly focused on racial and LGBTQ+ equity. The strategy should be examined to establish an efficient plan to support caregivers and their families. There should also be a review of its COVID-19 policies. Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, Congress should allow CMS to use the 340B data that HRSA collects rather than having CMS conduct its own survey, especially in view of the U.S. Supreme Court's American Hospital Association versus Becerra decision. The legislation should also create penalties for those who do not respond to HRSA's data collection. Legally define the locus of service as where the provider is located during the telehealth visit rather than where the patient is. With such a definition, states could continue to reserve their powers to establish the standards for licensure and scope of practice. The providers could ensure continuity and consistency of care no matter where their patients might move while maintaining the licenses that make the most sense for them. Americans are far more mobile and technologically advanced today than they were when most healthcare laws were written. Telehealth has become increasingly important, particularly during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. It also has great potential in rural and other areas where there are shortages of healthcare providers. HRSA's Office for the Advancement of Telehealth includes a program known as the Licensure Portability Grant Program, which bolsters state efforts to reform licensing laws to maximize telehealth flexibility. HRSA does not have the authority through this office to dictate licensure laws. That power has typically been reserved to the states. However, telehealth across state lines, when permitted, is interstate commerce, which can be regulated by the federal government according to the Constitution. Restore Trump religious and moral exemptions to the contraceptive mandate, also a CMS rule. HHS should rescind, if finalized, the regulation titled Coverage of Certain Preventive Services under the Affordable Care Act, proposed jointly by HHS, Treasury, and Labor. This rule proposes to amend Trump-era final rules regarding religious and moral exemptions and accommodations for coverage of certain preventive services under the ACA. Preventive services include contraception, and it appears the proposed rule would change the existing regulations for religious and moral exemptions to the ACA's contraception mandate. There is no need for further rulemaking that curtails existing exemptions and accommodations. Require HRSA to use rulemaking to update the Women's Preventive Services Mandate. The contraceptive mandate issued under Obamacare has been the source of years of egregious attacks on many Americans' religious and moral beliefs. The mandate was issued as part of the Women's Preventive Services Guidelines, which were issued without any rulemaking that involved public notice and an opportunity to comment. Instead, HRSA issued and changed the mandate by simply posting changes to its website. HRSA also started off not requiring coverage of fertility awareness-based methods of family planning, then requiring them, and then removing the requirement without notifying the public. A federal judge recently ruled that this failure to undergo notice and comment in issuing the mandate is unlawful. HRSA should be required to repromulgate any women's preventive services mandates through the notice and comment process that is compliant with the Administrative Procedures Act. Moreover, since the Obama administration, HRSA entered into long-term contracts with the pro-abortion American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, ACOG, and related entities to serve as an exclusive advisor with respect to the content of this mandate. HRSA has used this arrangement to ignore comments that members of the public were sometimes able to submit in the process. And ACOG has abused its position to attack HHS's allowance of religious and moral exemptions to the contraceptive mandate. HHS should rescind these contracts and establish an advisory committee that is compliant with the Federal Advisory Committee Act and has members that are committed to women's preventive services and are not pro-abortion ideologues. Expand inclusion of fertility awareness-based methods and supplies to family planning in the Women's Preventive Services Mandate. The ACA requires coverage of and prevents insurance plans from imposing any cost-sharing requirements on women who obtain preventive care and screenings as defined by HRSA. In 2016, HHS included instruction in fertility awareness-based methods as part of this requirement. However, in December 2021, HHS removed that language from its list without using the notice and comment process or giving any rationale, both of which are mandated by the Administrative Procedures Act. In August 2022, a federal court blocked this attempt to eliminate health insurance coverage for fertility awareness-based methods of family planning from requirements that cover at least 58 million women. And the judge made his ruling permanent in December 2022. HRSA should promulgate regulations consistent with this order. HHS should more thoroughly ensure that fertility awareness-based methods of family planning are part of women's preventive services under the ACA. FABs often involve costs for materials and supplies, and HHS should make clear that coverage of those items is also required. FABs are highly effective and allow women to make family planning choices in a manner that meets their needs and reflects their values. Eliminate men's preventive services from the Women's Preventive Services Mandate. In December 2021, HRSA updated its Women's Preventive Services Guidelines to include male condoms after claiming for years that it had no authority to do so because Congress explicitly limited the mandate to women's preventive care and screenings. HRSA should not incorporate exclusively male contraceptive methods into guidelines that specify they encompass only women's services. Eliminate the week-after pill from the contraceptive mandate as a potential abortifacient. One of the emergency contraceptives covered under the HRSA Preventive Services Guidelines is ELA, ulipristal acetate. Like its close cousin, the abortion pill mifepristone, ELA is a progesterone blocker and can prevent a recently fertilized embryo from implanting in a woman's uterus. HRSA should eliminate this potential abortifacient from the contraceptive mandate. Withdraw Ryan White guidance allowing funds to pay for cross-sex transition support. HRSA should withdraw all guidance encouraging Ryan White HIV/AIDS program service providers to provide controversial gender transition procedures or gender-affirming care, which cause irreversible physical and mental harm to those who receive them. Ensure that training for medical professionals, doctors, nurses, etc., and doulas is not being used for abortion training. HHS should ensure that training programs for medical professionals, including doctors, nurses, and doulas, are in full compliance with restrictions on abortion funding and conscience protection laws. In addition, HHS should 1. Investigate state medical school compliance with the Coates Snow Amendment, which prohibits discrimination against healthcare entities that do not provide or undergo training for abortion. 2. Ensure that the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, ACGME, complies with all relevant conscience statutes and regulations, and that states have taken the affirmative steps, for example, by issuing regulations, to assure compliance with Coates Snow. 3. Communicate to medical schools that any abortion-related training must be on an opt-in rather than opt-out basis. 4. Require states that receive HHS funds to issue regulations or enter into arrangements with accrediting bodies to comply with the Coates Snow Amendment's prohibition of mandatory abortion training by individuals or institutions. The Coates Snow Amendment specifically requires such state regulations or arrangements. Prioritize funding for home-based childcare, not universal daycare. As HRSA's Early Childhood Health page outlines, currently, only about half of U.S. preschoolers are on track with their development and ready for school. And more than 1 in 4 of children, 28%, who experience abuse or neglect are under 3 years old. Concurrently, children who spend significant time in daycare experience higher rates of anxiety, depression, and neglect as well as poor educational and developmental outcomes. Instead of providing universal daycare, funding should go to parents either to offset the cost of staying home with a child or to pay for familial, in-home childcare. Provide education and resources on early childhood health. By partnering with new organizations like the Center on Child and Family Poverty, HRSA should provide resources and information on the importance of the mother-child relationship in child well-being. This should include relationship education curricula that equip mothers and caregivers to connect with and improve their understanding of their infants, toddlers, and young children. Maternal and child health. Currently, the HRSA Maternal and Child Health Program is collecting data on the benefits of doulas in improving the health, safety, and emotional well-being of mothers at birth. Doulas provide a patient-focused, non-medical support system for single or married mothers that decreases the overall cesarean rate by 50%, the length of labor by 25%, the use of oxytocin by 40%, and requests for an epidural by 60%. Doulas often use the power of touch and massage to reduce stress and anxiety during labor. Given concerns about maternal mortality or postpartum depression that is worsened by poor birth experiences, doulas should be an active option for all women whether they are giving birth in a traditional hospital, through midwifery, or at home. Additionally, since most doula services are not covered by traditional insurance programs, the Maternal and Child Health Program should work to provide funding for low-income mothers. Indian Health Service, IHS. The Indian Health Service serves our American Indian and Alaska Native populations. Reforms are needed to improve America's ability to deliver on its promises to these important populations and must take account of cultural preferences and lifestyles, limitations due to geography, such as challenging terrain, and limited internet access. For example, contacting individuals within some of these communities and tribes during the COVID-19 pandemic proved to be difficult because many had transient addresses and unreliable cell service. During the transition to the Biden administration, IHS abandoned tribes as their sources of COVID-19 tests and vaccine supplies disappeared. It is important to guard against such situations in order to preserve these tribes' access to health resources during public health emergencies, PHEs. Even before the pandemic, services available to these populations through federal resources and personnel, such as vision care, were often scarce or non-existent. Patients in these populations should be empowered to rely on alternatives to IHS through better access to private healthcare providers. Exploring positive reforms contained in the VA Mission Act could reveal similar opportunities for increased options and access for American Indians and Alaska Natives. Rural health. A growing concern is the decreasing access to healthcare services for Americans living in rural, less populated areas. Many find themselves in regions that were not previously as rural as industries move away, taking with them economic prosperity and often medical providers. Others are in essential professions such as farming that by nature necessitate living in regions with fewer city accommodations and economic opportunities. Seeking space for one's family and cultivating the land are valued goals that are deeply rooted in America's fabric. Both Congress and an administration must continually keep in mind how healthcare policies uniquely affect these regions because their market trends and populations are different from those of more populous regions. Often, rural patients face an hour's drive to the nearest medical provider or facility or have limited or no internet access, which restricts their access to telehealth services, especially video visits. To improve its healthcare policies that affect rural regions, HHS should reduce the regulatory burden and unleash private innovation that can discover solutions to unique, local needs. Implement or encourage policies that increase the supply of healthcare providers, such as increased telehealth access and interstate licensure, a historically state matter, including for volunteers wishing to provide temporary charitable services across state lines. Encourage flexibility in modes of healthcare delivery, including less expensive alternatives to hospitals and telehealth independent of expensive air ambulances. Office of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the Office of the Secretary necessarily set the tone for the entire department. The Secretary is the most accountable individual within HHS and, along with his or her immediate staff, should therefore be responsible for setting the policies that govern the department's operations instead of allowing the operational divisions to assume the leading role in policymaking, thereby diffusing responsibility. Practical reforms to enhance the Secretary's accountability should include the following. Restrict HHS's ability to declare indefinite public health emergencies, PHEs. Currently, HHS is merely required to notify Congress of such a declaration within 48 hours. Congress should establish a set time frame for any PHE, placing on the Secretary the burden of proof as to why an extension of the PHE is necessary. Reinstate the HHS sunset, securing updated and necessary statutory evaluations timely rule. Congress should codify the now-reversed Trump administration rule that required all HHS agencies to review regulations retrospectively and publish results. Without such a review, regulations expire. Investigate, expose, and remediate any instances in which HHS violated people's rights by 1. Colluding with big tech to censor dissenting opinions during COVID. 2. Colluding with abortion advocates and LGBT advocates to violate conscience protection laws and the Hyde Amendment. The Life Agenda. The Office of the Secretary should eliminate the HHS Reproductive Healthcare Access Task Force and install a pro-life task force to ensure that all of the department's divisions seek to use their authority to promote the life and health of women and their unborn children. Additionally, HHS should return to being known as the Department of Life by explicitly rejecting the notion that abortion is healthcare and by restoring its mission statement under the strategic plan and elsewhere to include furthering the health and well-being of all Americans, from conception to natural death. The next administration should create a dedicated special representative for domestic women's health. In the Trump administration, there was a special representative for global women's health that focused on international issues, but this position lacked authority to be the lead on international policies because of overlapping issues with the U.S. Department of State and USAID, and at times a lack of clarity as to the lead point of contact and policy decisions at the White House. The new special representative would serve as the lead on all matters of federal domestic policy development related to life and family with support from the DPC for implementation and coordination among agencies. In the post-Dobbs era, advancing support for mothers will include coordination among agencies outside of HHS, and the special representative would provide a clear focal point for all issues related to protecting life and serving families. The Family Agenda. The Secretary's anti-discrimination policy statements should never conflate sex with gender identity or sexual orientation. Rather, the Secretary should proudly state that men and women are biological realities that are crucial to the advancement of life sciences and medical care, and that married men and women are the ideal natural family structure because all children have a right to be raised by the men and women who conceived them. Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health, OSH, / Office of the Surgeon General, OSG. The Assistant Secretary for Health, ASH, is the 4-star admiral for the United States Public Health Service Commissioned Corps, USPCHS, and the Surgeon General, SG, is the 3-star admiral. The ASH is tasked with overseeing not only the USPCHS, but also 10 regional health offices, multiple presidential and secretarial advisory committees, and other offices such as the Offices of Minority Health, Women's Health, and Population Affairs. The Secretary can further expand the ASH's responsibilities, for example, by designating the ASH as liaison to the CDC. The SG officially oversees the daily operations of the USPCHS, although those are actually under the control of the director of the USPCHS Commissioned Corps Headquarters. The SG also issues information to the public, Surgeon General's advisories, calls to action, and reports, serving in effect as a key public health spokesperson for the federal government. USPCHS officers are assigned to various agencies such as the CDC, NIH, and Bureau of Prisons. Their organizational structure is similar in some respects to the National Guard's, and their salaries are paid primarily by the agencies to which they are assigned, which serves to limit USPCHS appropriations. USPCHS officers can be deployed on missions to respond to domestic or international crises, for example, a hurricane in Florida or an Ebola outbreak in Africa, at any time. The USPCHS should be restructured to make it more like its sister uniformed services with a more streamlined chain of command and corresponding appropriations to ensure efficiency and clarity of mission. Its core mission should be refocused to emphasize prompt, responsive deployments that meet specific criteria and are less dependent on the various agencies to which the officers are assigned. Fulfillment of specific tasks should not be duplicated by non-uniformed civil servants and USPCHS officers, and any roles that can be filled by civilians should be filled by them. The ASH and SG positions should be combined into one 4-star position with the rank, responsibilities, and authority of the ASH retained, but with the title of Surgeon General and some of the SG's communications responsibilities, which would include disseminating other HHS messages and sharing general medical advice without legal weight. The holder of this consolidated position, which should be filled by a healthcare provider, would be better positioned to ensure that the USPCHS is properly focused and deployed. With such reforms, the supporting office, previously the OSH and OSG, would be better equipped than other HHS offices or agencies to reduce silos and consolidate or eliminate duplicative functions. Congress should consider legislation that would require this office to take such actions or at least make such recommendations to the Secretary. Such legislation would require a thorough analysis of the various legal authorities impacting the department's current organizational structure. The position previously known as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health should be combined with and have the title of Deputy Surgeon General and become a 3-star position with operational control, including financial and deployment decisions. The director of the headquarters should be responsible for implementing the decisions of the Deputy Surgeon General. Promoting life and family. In dealing with sexually transmitted diseases and unwanted pregnancies, the OSH should focus on root cause analysis with a focus on strengthening marriage and sexual risk avoidance. Strong leadership is needed in the Office of Science and Medicine to drive investigative review of literature for a variety of issues, including the effect of abortion on prematurity and breast cancer, lack of evidence for so-called gender-affirming care, and physical and emotional damage following cross-sex treatments, especially on children. The OSH should withdraw all recommendations of and support for cross-sex medical interventions and gender-affirming care. Title X. The Title X Family Planning Program should be reframed with a focus on better education around fertility awareness and holistic family planning, and a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Population Affairs that understands the program and is able to work within its legislative framework, ideally an MD. In addition, the Office of Population Affairs should eliminate religious discrimination in grant selections and guarantee the right of conscience and religious freedom of healthcare workers and participants in the Title X program. In 2021, HHS reversed a Trump administration regulation that required grantees to maintain strict physical and financial separation between Title X activity and abortion-related activity. Under the Biden administration's regulation, Title X activity can be conducted alongside abortion activity without strict physical and financial separation. The regulation also requires grantees to refer for abortions despite sincere moral or religious objections. This effectively bans otherwise qualified pro-life grantees from participating in the program. HHS should rescind the Biden administration's regulation and reinstate the Trump administration regulation for the program. It should also do this quickly. The Biden administration completed its regulatory process and issued a final rule in less than 9 months, and expand the potential grantee population beyond abortion providers like Planned Parenthood. Congress should complement these efforts by passing legislation such as the Title X Abortion Provider Prohibition Act, which would prohibit family planning grants from going to entities that perform abortions or provide funding to other entities that perform abortions. This would help to protect the integrity of the Title X program even under an abortion-friendly administration. Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, ASPR versus FEMA. When the President declares a national emergency, per the Stafford Act, related to a public health emergency declared by the HHS Secretary, FEMA is activated and controls instead of HHS/ASPR. While this arrangement has some benefits because of FEMA's unique logistical capabilities, the arrangement should be reviewed, especially considering the COVID-19 pandemic. For improvements in efficiency according to expertise and available resources, reduced confusion for ASPR and among HHS agencies, and avoidance of duplicated efforts among agencies and personnel. Strategic National Stockpile. The President should invoke the Defense Production Act, which is a form of temporary takeover of private enterprises only in the gravest circumstances. The Strategic National Stockpile, SNS, should be reformed to consider the potential supply chain disruptions of pandemics or global conflicts. Also, during the COVID pandemic, many states received ventilators from the SNS and hoarded them in places where a rush of COVID patients needing ventilators never materialized. The SNS should clarify its mission as supplier of last resort to the federal government, state governments, or first responders and key medical staff, and should not portray itself as serving the public as a whole. Office of General Counsel, OGC. The Office of General Counsel is essential to ensuring that HHS is operating within the bounds of its numerous governing statutes. However, legal caution can outweigh practical necessity and often slows processes and decisions when time is of the essence. Such problems were evident both before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Internal processes should be reformed to streamline necessary legal determinations during crises, and general processes should be reviewed for efficiency. OGC should also rescind its PrEP Act liability memo. OGC issued a PrEP Act liability memo that suspended application of civil rights and other laws in the context of the administration of covered countermeasures during the pandemic. It should be rescinded as contrary to law. Rescind efforts to curtail OCR authority over conscience and religious freedom. All OGC memos and Federal Register notices of organization or delegations of authority moving any OCR conscience and religious freedom enforcement to OGC, including RFRA, should be rescinded, and independent authority over these matters should be restored to OCR. Encourage DOJ to repeal OLC memos allowing abortion funding despite Hyde and memos allowing federal enclave immunity to perform abortions despite the Assimilative Crimes Act. Rescind legal analysis that authorized HHS to impose a moratorium on rental evictions during COVID. Rescind the OGC legal analysis saying that the injunction in Bowen v. American Hospital Association prevents any proposed HHS regulations or enforcement actions concerning the denial of care to newborn infants with disabilities by covered healthcare entities without or against parental consent. Rescind the legal analysis supporting the Biden administration's decision to dismiss the University of Vermont Medical Center case dealing with the forced participation of a nurse in abortion in violation of law. Rescind the legal analysis restoring $200 million in Medicaid funds to California after having been found to be in violation of the Weldon Amendment by OCR. Office of Global Affairs. OGA. The Director of the Office of Global Affairs should have the title of Assistant Secretary so that he or she can adequately represent HHS and the Secretary and serve as the lead on global health diplomacy for the government. The designation, Director, is not understood to indicate the leadership role that this position holds in the international arena. In addition, all divisions that work on international health efforts should be responsive to requests and direction from the Assistant Secretary with coordination for all health diplomacy emanating from OGA. OGA should have a clear and consistent voice for the administration's pro-life and pro-family priorities in all international engagements. OGA should hold oversight authority for implementation of the Mexico City policy throughout all divisions. Every effort should be made to locate all OGA staff in the same building for better oversight and communication. Health attaches in various global locations should be trained in the administration's policies with clear expectations communicated and with accountability, including replacement, when their conduct and advocacy are contrary to administration policies and programmatic priorities. Office for Civil Rights, OCR Conscience Enforcement. Existing statutes that protect rights of conscience, such as the Church, Coates, Snow, and Weldon Amendments, do not explicitly provide a private right of action that would allow victims to seek legal redress in court. At the same time, when it continues to fund governmental and private entities that violate these laws, HHS is spending taxpayer funds unlawfully. Under liberal administrations, OCR has amassed a poor record of devoting resources to conscience and religious freedom enforcement and is often complicit in approving or looking the other way at the administration's own attacks on religious liberty. Congress should pass the Conscience Protection Act so that victims can pursue redress through courts without having to depend exclusively on OCR. In addition, OCR should return to Trump administration policies that initiated robust enforcement of these conscience laws. It should restore and fully fund the Office of the Deputy Director for the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division, CRFD, and ensure that it has the necessary delegations from the Secretary to enforce these laws. The Secretary should give adequate delegations to OCR to pursue enforcement of conscience laws, including RFRA, and require all HHS components that provide funding or grants to cooperate with OCR's CRFD investigations. The Secretary, the Deputy Secretary, And principals and other HHS divisions should endorse the remedial measures recommended by OCR-CRFD and limit territorial objections and slow down attempts by other divisional officials, including OGC. HHS should withdraw funding from any violating entities that refuse to correct their behavior. And OCR-CRFD should work with ASFAR to ensure that all grant announcements and instruments inform grantees and applicants of their obligations to comply with federal healthcare conscience laws, specifically as a condition of obtaining or maintaining their funding. A draft OCR-RFRA and religious freedom rule from the Trump administration should be issued and finalized. These regulations would provide a clear process for OCR's enforcement in coordination with other HHS divisions and existing HHS grants regulations. HHS should reestablish waivers for state and child welfare agencies for religious exemptions, especially for faith-based adoption and foster care agencies. It should also rescind subjective case-by-case evaluations for religious and faith-based organizations that request religious exemptions. These case-by-case determinations are currently coordinated with ACF and OCR. The recommended waivers should be granted to all states and agencies that request them, and OCR memos finding that RFRA would be violated if the waivers are not granted should be restored. HHS should restore OCR authority to review requests for and render opinions on the application of RFRA to requests for religious accommodation of people, families, and doctors who cannot in good conscience take or administer vaccines, including those made or tested with aborted fetal cell lines. HHS should restore Section 1557, Section 504, and other OCR regulations and fix guidance documents. In 2020, the Trump administration's OCR published regulations under Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act that restored the agency's enforcement of that law to the limits of its statutory text, deferred to the ACA's widespread use of a binary biological conception of sex discrimination, and specified that the regulation must comply with the religious exemption and abortion neutrality clauses in Title IX, from which it is derived, as well as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and other laws. Courts blocked core provisions of that rule from going into effect. In 2022, the Biden administration proposed to reinstate a rule contradicting the scope of the statute and imposing non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. It is expected that this rule will be finalized in 2023, even though several courts have issued rulings against the interpretation on which it is based. OCR should return its enforcement of sex discrimination to the statutory framework of Section 1557 and Title IX. Specifically, it should 1. Remove all guidance issued under the Biden administration concerning sexual orientation and gender identity under Section 1557, particularly the May 2021 announcement of enforcement and March 2022 statement threatening states that protect minors from genital mutilation. 2. Issue a general statement of policy specifying that it will not enforce any prohibition on sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in the Section 1557 regulation, and that it will prioritize compliance with the First Amendment, RFRA, and federal conscience laws in any case implicating those claims. DOJ should commit to defending these actions aggressively against inevitable court challenges, including under cases such as Heckler v. Cheney. 3. Issue a proposed rule to restore the Trump regulations under Section 1557, explicitly interpreting the law not to include sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination based on the textual approach to male and female biology taken by Congress in the ACA, the need to recognize biological distinctions as part of the sound practice of healthcare, and the need to ensure protections of medical judgment and conscience. DOJ should agree to defend this rule to the Supreme Court if necessary. 4. Issue a general statement of policy announcing that it plans to enforce Section 1557 discrimination bans by refocusing on serious cases of race, sex, and disability discrimination. In particular, OCR should highlight its 2019 investigation and voluntary resolution agreement with Michigan State University based on the sexual abuse of gymnasts by Larry Nassar. OCR should also coordinate with the Department of Education on a public education and civil rights enforcement campaign to ensure that female college athletes who become pregnant are no longer pressured to obtain abortions, pursue race discrimination claims against entities that adopt or impose racially discriminatory policies, such as those based on critical race theory, and announce its intention to enforce disability rights laws to protect children born prematurely, children with disabilities, and children born alive after abortions. 5. Issue and finalize the Trump-era draft disability rights regulations concerning crisis standards of care and use of quality of life adjusted years, CALIES, and reissue and finalize a disability regulation withdrawn by the Biden administration that prohibited discriminatory application of assisted suicide and denial of life-saving treatments for disabled newborns. OCR should withdraw its pharmacy abortion mandate guidance. OCR should withdraw its obligations under federal civil rights laws to ensure access to comprehensive reproductive health care services, guidance for retail pharmacies, which purports to address non-discrimination obligations of pharmacies under federal civil rights laws and in fact orders them to stock and dispense first-trimester abortion drugs. The guidance invents this so-called requirement and fails to acknowledge that pharmacies and pharmacists have the right not to participate in abortions, including pill-induced abortions, if doing so would violate their sincere moral or religious objections. Moreover, no federal civil rights laws preempt state pro-life statutes. OCR should withdraw its Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, guidance on abortion. OCR should withdraw its June 2022 guidance that purports to address patient privacy concerns following the Dobbs decision, but is actually a politicized statement in favor of abortion and against Dobbs. HIPAA covers patients in the womb, but this guidance treats them as non-persons contrary to law. The guidance is unnecessary and contributes to ideologically motivated fearmongering about abortion after Dobbs. Chapter 15. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, administers a web of federal programs with mandates to support access to homeownership and affordable rental housing, relieve temporary housing instability for homeless persons, preserve a stable inventory of public housing units, and enforce mandates with powers to settle compliance matters ranging from housing quality standards to housing discrimination cases. Politicians across party lines use HUD to promise ever greater public benefits. In addition, HUD programs tend to perpetuate the notion of bureaucratically provided housing as a basic life need and, whether intentionally or not, fail to acknowledge that these public benefits too often have led to intergenerational poverty traps, have implicitly penalized family formation in traditional two-parent marriages, and have discouraged work and income growth, thereby limiting upward mobility. A new conservative administration will therefore need to reset HUD. This effort should specifically include a broad reversal of the Biden administration's persistent implementation of corrosive progressive ideologies across the department's programs. Implement an action plan across both process and people. This plan should include both the immediate redelegation of authority to a cadre of political appointees and the urgent implementation of administrative regulatory actions with respect to HUD policy and program eligibility. Reverse HUD's mission creep over nearly a century of program implementation dating from the department's New Deal forebears. HUD's new political leadership team will need to re-examine the federal government's role in housing markets across the nation and consider whether it is time for a reform, reinvention, and renewal that transfers department functions to separate federal agencies, states, and localities. Administered by the Housing and Home Finance Agency, with a proposed fiscal year, FY, budget authority totaling $71.9 billion and 8,326 full-time equivalent, FTE, employees. It remains the largest government agency charged with implementing federal housing policy. In addition to its headquarters in Washington, D.C., HUD has 10 regional offices as well as field offices and centers to implement specialized operational and enforcement responsibilities. HUD program offices also interface with various networks of implementing organizations such as locally chartered public housing agencies, PCHAs, and federal, state, and local government and judicial bodies as well as such private industry participants as mortgage lenders. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development can delegate authority to various entities across an array of HUD programs. The Secretary also oversees the Office of the Deputy Secretary, the Office of Hearings and Appeals, OCHA, the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization, OSDBU, Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, CFBNP. The Office of the Secretary also comprises a team of politically appointed positions and career support staff. Each of the following offices should be headed by political appointees except where otherwise noted. Office of Administration, headed by the Chief Administration Officer. The Office of Administration has responsibilities for the Office of the Chief Human Capital Officer, OCHO, headed by the Chief Human Capital Officer, currently a career position, and the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer, CPO, headed by the Chief Procurement Officer, currently a career position. Office of the Chief Financial Officer, headed by the Chief Financial Officer. Office of the Chief Information Officer, headed by the Chief Information Officer. Office of Public Affairs, headed by a Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary, AS, or Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, DAS. Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Relations, CIR, headed by a Senate-confirmed AS or DAS. Office of Community Planning and Development, CPD, headed by a Senate-confirmed AS or Principal. DAS. CPD administers various entitlement and non-entitlement programs across community development, disaster recovery, and housing for the homeless and individuals with special needs, including housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, HOPWA. The two largest CPD-administered programs are the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, program, which includes disaster recovery funding, and the Home Investment Partnerships Program, HOME. CPD's Relocation and Real Estate Division, RRED, has departmental delegated authority for the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act of 1970. Office of Public and Indian Housing, PIH, headed by a Senate-confirmed AS or DAS. PIH administers public housing and tenant-based rental assistance programs, as well as authorities for Native American and Native Hawaiian housing assistance and loan guarantee programs under the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, NASTA. Tenant-based rental assistance represents the major portion of HUD's non-emergency discretionary budget. HUD describes its Housing Choice Voucher program as an essential component of the federal housing safety net for people in need. PIH also implements funding for the Self-Sufficiency Coordinator Program, the Public Housing Fund, operating and capital funds for PHA administration of Section 9 public housing and Section 8 voucher programs, and choice neighborhoods. Zeroed out during the Trump administration budget request, but included in HUD's FY 2023 budget, which requests $250 million for the program. Office of Housing and Federal Housing Administration, FHA, headed by a dual-hatted, Senate-confirmed AS and Federal Housing Commissioner, or Acting Federal Housing Commissioner. The Office of Housing oversees implementation of the department's Project-Based Rental Assistance, PBRA, Multifamily Housing Portfolio, Section 202 Supportive Housing for the Elderly Program, Section 811 Program for Disabled Persons Housing, and Housing Counseling Assistance Program. The Federal Housing Administration administers the Mutual Mortgage Insurance Program, MMF, and various other mortgage insurance, direct loan, and loan guarantee programs for single-family housing, multifamily housing, hospitals, and healthcare facilities that meet certain conditions. Government National Mortgage Association, GNMA, headed by a Senate-confirmed GNMA president or executive vice president. GNMA oversees more than $2 billion in federal guarantees to mortgage-backed securities structured from mortgages that are pooled from various federal programs, including mortgages backed by programs outside of HUD. Principally the single-family mortgage guarantee programs administered by the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, and the Rural Housing Service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA. FHA-insured single-family housing mortgages comprise the largest share of GNMA-guaranteed mortgage-backed securities. Office of Departmental Equal Employment Opportunity, headed by a director. Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, FGO, headed by a Senate-confirmed AS or DAS. The Assistant Secretary for FHEO is the designated HUD official responsible for enforcing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and Section 109 of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. After informal efforts to resolve noncompliance, the AS for FHEO may make a formal finding of noncompliance and initiate enforcement action before an administrative tribunal or a referral to the Department of Justice. Office of General Counsel, OGC, headed by the General Counsel or Principal Deputy General Counsel. OGC handles department-wide legal and compliance oversight advice with supervision responsibilities for the Deputy General Counsel for Housing Programs, Deputy General Counsel for Operations, and Deputy General Counsel for Enforcement and Fair Housing, as well as the Departmental Enforcement Center. Office of Healthy Homes and Lead Hazard Control, OHHLHC, headed by a director. OHHLHC was established in the early 1990s to eliminate lead-based paint hazards in America's privately owned and low-income housing, address healthy housing initiatives, and enforce lead-based paint regulations authorized under the Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act of 1992, Title X of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1992. These functions overlap with similar functions of the Environmental Protection Agency, also authorized to enforce lead-based paint regulations under Title X, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Healthy Homes Initiative, Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program, and National Asthma Control Program. Office of Policy Development and Research, PDR, headed by a Senate-confirmed AS or DAS. PDR was established in the early 1970s and today administers research activities, including external contract research grants, and provides analytical and policy advice to senior HUD staff. PDR also provides publicly available statistics through the American Housing Survey, AHS, which is sponsored by HUD and conducted by the Census Bureau, the State of the City's Data Systems, data on the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, LHC, and annual fair market rents and income limits data, among other statistical publications and datasets on the characteristics of families assisted under HUD programs. Office of Inspector General, OG, headed by an Inspector General. The OG is independent of HUD and one of 12 inspectors general across the federal government authorized under the Inspector General Act of 1978. Operating under its own budget authority and strategic plan, the HUD OG conducts internal and external audits and investigations of HUD programs and operations. While independent of HUD and holding no enforcement powers over HUD programs, HUD OG works closely with the Office of General Counsel, the Departmental Enforcement Center, and HUD program offices. The Inspector General serves as an advisor to and non-voting member of the FHA Mortgagee Review Board. Office of Field Policy and Management, FPM, headed by an Assistant Deputy Secretary for FPM. FPM supports the Secretary through regional and field office communication and external engagement with various community stakeholders to ensure the successful implementation of secretarial initiatives and special projects. HUD reform pillars, ideally. Congress would redelegate authorities that have been diverted to HUD's administrative bureaucracy and safeguard taxpayers against the mission creep that inevitably occurs when Congress delegates power to an empowered and unelected bureaucracy that is insulated by civil service protections. If implemented, the reforms proposed in this chapter can help a new conservative administration to use its Article 2 powers to rectify bureaucratic overreach, reverse the expansion of programs beyond their statutory authority, and end progressive policies that have been put in place at the department. It is hoped that a future Congress under conservative leadership will enact legislative reforms of HUD programs. With or without congressional action, however, it is vital that a conservative administration immediately institute guardrails across HUD programs to remove the administrative state's bureaucratic overreach of Article 1 authorities, thereby ensuring formal execution of Article 2 process and personnel reforms of the sort outlined below. First day and first year administrative reforms. A new conservative administration can and should implement the following reforms that focus on both people and process. Implementation of these reforms simply requires courageous political leadership across all of HUD's key appointed positions. HUD political leadership should immediately assign all delegated powers to politically appointed DAs, DS, and other office leadership positions, change any current career leadership positions into political and non-career appointment positions, and use senior executive service, SES, transfers to install motivated and aligned leadership. The President should issue an executive order making the HUD Secretary a member of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which will gain broader oversight authorities to address foreign threats, particularly from China, with oversight of foreign ownership of real estate in both rental and ownership markets of single-family and multifamily housing, with trillions worth of real estate secured across HUD's portfolio. The Secretary should initiate a HUD task force consisting of politically appointed personnel to identify and reverse all actions taken by the Biden administration to advance progressive ideology. The Office of the Secretary or the leadership in the Office of General Counsel should conduct a thorough review of all sub-regulatory guidance that has been instituted outside of the Administrative Procedure Act, APA. Additionally, departmental leadership should 1. Immediately end the Biden administration's property appraisal and valuation equity, PAVE, policies and reverse any Biden administration actions that threaten to undermine the integrity of real estate appraisals. 2. Repeal climate change initiatives and spending in the department's budget request. 3. Repeal the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, AFFH, regulation reinstituted under the Biden administration and any other uses of special purpose credit authorities to further equity. 4. Eliminate the new Housing Supply Fund. The Office of the Secretary should recommence proposed regulation put forward under the Trump administration that would prohibit non-citizens, including all mixed-status families, from living in all federally assisted housing. HUD's statutory obligations include providing housing for American citizens who are in need. HUD reforms must also ensure alignment with reforms implemented by other federal agencies where immigration status impacts public programs, certainly to include any reforms in the public charge regulatory framework administered by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS. Local welfare organizations, not the federal government, should step up to provide welfare for the housing of non-citizens. The Office of the Secretary should execute regulatory and sub-regulatory guidance actions across HUD programs and applicable to all relevant stakeholders. That would restrict program eligibility when admission would threaten the protection of the life and health of individuals and fail to encourage upward mobility and economic advancement through household self-sufficiency. Where admissible in regulatory action, HUD should implement reforms reducing the implicit anti-marriage bias in housing assistance programs, strengthen work and work readiness requirements, implement maximum term limits for residents in PBRA and TBRA programs, and end housing first policies so that the department prioritizes mental health and substance abuse issues before jumping to permanent interventions in homelessness. Notwithstanding administrative reforms, Congress should enact legislation that protects life and eliminates provisions in federal housing and welfare benefits policies that discourage work, marriage, and meaningful paths to upward economic mobility. The AS or DAS for the Office of Policy Development and Research should suspend all external research and evaluation grants in the Office of Policy Development and Research and end or realign to another office any functions that are not involved in the collection and use of data and survey administration functions and do not facilitate the execution of regulatory impact analysis studies. FHA leadership should increase the mortgage insurance premium, MIP, for all products above 20-year terms and maintain MIP for all products below 20-year terms. And all refinances. FHA should encourage wealth-building homeownership opportunities, which can be accomplished best through shorter duration mortgages. Ideally, Congress would contemplate a fundamental revision of FHA's statutory restriction of single-family housing mortgage insurance to first-time homebuyers. This would include, with support from HUD leadership, 1. Moving the Home Equity Conversion Mortgages, HCM, program once again to its own special risk insurance fund. 2. Revising loan limit determinations. 3. Providing statutory flexibility for shorter-term products that amortize principal earlier and faster. Statutorily restricting eligibility for first-time homebuyers and abandoning the affirmative obligation authorities erected for the single-family housing programs across federal agencies and government-sponsored enterprises. The HUD Secretary should move the HUD Real Estate Assessment Center, REAC, from PIH to the Office of Housing, which already implements property standards in its multifamily housing lending programs through the Multifamily Accelerated Processing, MAP, lending guidelines. Giving HUD the authority to streamline the enforcement of compliance with housing standards across the federal government and flexibility for physical inspections through private accreditation should also be considered. HUD should maintain its requested budget authority for modernization initiatives that are applicable to the Office of the Chief Information Officer and program offices across the department. Longer-term policy reform considerations. Congress has charged HUD principally with mandates for construction of the nation's affordable housing stock in addition to setting and enforcing standards for decent housing and fair housing enforcement. Regardless of intent, HUD's efforts have yielded mixed results at best. Even today, more than a half-century after Congress put enforcement of so-called fair housing in the hands of the HUD bureaucracy, implementation of this policy is muddled by the repeated application of affirmative race-based policies. Also, the production mandate for HUD's housing portfolio has waned for decades, with the department effectively working to maintain the public housing portfolio from the late 1990s when the Faircloth Amendment capped HUD's public housing portfolio. Longer-term reforms of HUD rental assistance programs should encourage choice and competition for renters, encourage participation by landlords where appropriate, and encourage all non-elderly, able-bodied adults to move towards self-sufficiency. This can be pursued through regulations and legislative reforms that seek to strengthen work requirements, limit the period during which households are eligible for housing benefits, and add flexibility to rent payment terms to facilitate the movement of households towards self-sufficiency. Obviously, using government vouchers or other such programs to expand housing choice options is not without its downsides. The turn toward mobility vouchers constitutes an abandonment of America's public housing stock, and efforts to increase competition in the public housing market must not come at the expense of local autonomy and the ability of cities, towns, neighborhoods, and communities to choose for themselves the sort of housing they want to allow. Freedom of association and self-government at the most local level possible must remain primary considerations in any conservative effort to increase competition in the public housing market. Congress should also consider those areas in which federal policy negatively interacts with private markets, including when federal policy crowds out private sector development and exacerbates affordability challenges that persist across the nation. It is essential that legislation provides states and localities maximal flexibility to pursue locally designed policies and minimize the likelihood of federal preemption of local land use and zoning decisions. In the same manner, Congress should prioritize any and all legislative support for the single-family home. Homeownership forms the backbone of the American dream. The purchase of a home is the largest investment most Americans will make in their lifetimes, and homeownership remains the most accessible way to build generational wealth for millions of Americans. For these reasons, American homeowners and citizens know best what is in the interest of their neighborhoods and communities. Localities rather than the federal government must have the final say in zoning laws and regulations, and a conservative administration should oppose any efforts to weaken single-family zoning. Along the same lines, Congress can propose tax credits for the renovation or repair of housing stock in rural areas so that more Americans are able to access the American dream of homeownership. Additionally, enhanced statutory authorities for local autonomy should extend to the prioritizing of federal rental assistance subsidies that emphasize choice and mobility in housing voucher subsidies over static, site-based subsidies, and provide authority for maximal flexibility to direct PHA land sales that involve the existing stock of public housing units. Congress must consider the future of the public housing model. At best, any new public investments will provide maintenance funds to bring substandard housing units and properties up to livability standards, but will still fail to address larger aims of upward mobility and dynamism for local housing markets where land can be sold by PHAs and put to greater economic use, thereby benefiting entire local economies through greater private investment, productivity and employment opportunities, and increased tax revenue. Any long-term view of HUD's future must include maintaining the strong financial operations and reliable reporting that are needed to run a $50 billion per year agency. Before the Trump administration, HUD effectively did not have a chief financial officer, CFO, for 8 years, and HUD's financial infrastructure inevitably deteriorated. The department's auditors were unable to conclude that HUD's internal operations were producing accurate financial reporting. The auditors had identified multiple material weaknesses and significant deficiencies in the department's internal financial controls. Overall, the deterioration of HUD's financial infrastructure led to a lack of accountability with respect to the use of taxpayer funds, as well as to pervasive difficulties with operations and program implementation. However, by hiring a new CFO from the private sector with a proven track record of visionary leadership, HUD was able to implement an agency-wide governance structure that improved its financial processes and internal controls and harnessed the power of innovative new technologies to bring a modernized business mindset to the agency's financial infrastructure. By the end of the Trump administration, for the first time in nearly a decade, HUD was able to address all of its previously identified material weaknesses, and the auditors were able to issue their first clean audit report on HUD's financial statements and internal controls. Finally, and more fundamentally, Congress could consider a wholesale overhaul of HUD that contemplates devolving many HUD functions to states and localities, with any remaining federal functions consolidated to other federal agencies, for example, by transferring loan guarantee programs to SBA, moving Indian housing programs to the Department of the Interior, moving rental assistance, mortgage insurance programs, and GNMA to a redesignated housing and home finance agency. Generally, this reform path could consolidate some programs, eliminate others that have failed to produce meaningful long-run results, and narrow the scope of many programs so that they're closer to what they were when they were created. End chapter 15. End hour 16.